Friends, welcome to part 4 of our video tutorial on assignment 9. In this part of our video presentation, I will show you how to create some of the pivot tables that are described in your assignment 9 file. Before you attempt building pivot tables, I strongly recommend, in fact I require you, to read the 3-part tutorial on creating pivot tables. Now this tutorial, this actually 4-part tutorial, it has part 4, but I'm only suggesting requiring part 1 through 3. This is a great tutorial that goes into all kinds of details explaining what pivot tables are and how to create different types of pivot tables. So you may need that knowledge. You need that knowledge because it will be covered in exam 3, but you also will need some of that knowledge for doing assignment 9. So my demonstration will only cover the essence. I'll just try to show you the direction in which you need to go for creating all those pivot tables described here. If you want to learn about details, then this is where you need to go. In fact, I would like to say that pivot tables is a very powerful analytical tool. You can do so much analysis just using this particular analytical tool of Excel. In fact, I've met quite a few people who kept saying that pivot tables is the most useful thing they ever learned in Excel, because it's very relevant for their job, especially when your job involves processing large volumes of transactional data. Let's say something related to sales, or maybe something related to networking parameters. The kind of any kind of data that is presented to you in a transactional format. So pivot tables is a great tool for summarizing the data and also discovering certain patterns or relationships in that data. So I strongly suggest to go through the pivot tables tutorial that I posted here, and once again this will be covered by exam 3. Okay, so let's go to the first table that you need to create, the summary table. Now, I already showed you how to create this table. You create this table by importing that summary data query from Access. So we already have it right here. And remember, I created a name for this table, which is concussions. Now I'll just change the name to summary. Okay. So let's go to table number 2, or tab 2. So here we have the following pivot tables: injuries by type of game field and side of ball. So here we have rows that show whether the game field was grass or turf, and here we have positions of players like defense and offense. Now I'd like to tell you this. You see, the 49% basically represents the total number of players in the league that are in the defensive position, and then 51 represents the total percent of players in the entire league that are in offensive positions. So this data is given to you. You cannot really, I don't think you can calculate it from, you cannot calculate it from the injury concussions data that you have, because that data is about only players who received the concussion. It's not about all players in the league. Okay, so those percentages are given to you. Now the reason, I'll jump forward a little bit. The reason you need those percentages, because later on you need to convert numbers to percentages and compare expected distribution or expected frequency in cells versus observed. But I'll leave it at that. At first I'll just show you how to create this table, and then we'll talk more about converting those values into percentages. Okay. So this is what you need to convert to create a table like this one. You need to go to Insert, and then you select Pivot Table. So you need to insert a pivot table. Now immediately, because I pointed my my mouse here to this table, it recognizes that you will use the concussions table. That's the name that you gave to this import previously. I will use a new worksheet because you need to create a new tab for each of the tables. And that's about it. So I'll just press OK. So here we have like a placeholder for a pivot table. So going back to our document file, we need to name it by game field and side. Okay. So I'll just rename it by game field and side Okay. Now in this, let me explain what this area means. Like here we have 4 areas for a pivot table. So basically, you need to specify which variables are the ones available. So you see, like those are the variables or rows. I mean, not rows, variables or basically data about injuries that is available to you from that summary table. Okay. So this is the complete list. So basically, you need to select which variables will be rows, or which variables will be columns. Here you can select which variable will be filtered. For example, let's say you want to have data about injuries by position, which is your column, and then here you have type of game field, grass or turf, which is your rows, just like what you have in this table, right? You have defense and offense as your columns, and then type of grass, type of field, grass or turf as your rows, right? And here you want to have values, meaning like the variable that will be used to provide values to the intercept of columns and rows, at the intercept of columns and rows. Okay, so in our case that will be concussions. And then once you do that, you can add a filter. So let's say by team. So you want to see this data for particular teams, so you can filter which teams you want to see, just one team, two teams, or all of the teams. So those are the areas that you will use for creating a pivot tables. Now in our case, since in columns we have defense or offense, meaning the position type. No, it's side. Yes, it's side variable. So we'll select side and we'll put it into the column area. Okay. So immediately we have something like this. Now for rows, we'll need just like here, we need type of game field, right? So we'll click here. But for now we don't have any values. Now for values we will need to have injury number, because we are counting concussions for each of the positions and also for each of the game field types. Now you notice like these numbers, they don't make sense, because what happens is that we have a sum of injury num, which means that we create a sum for all injury codes. This doesn't make sense, because it doesn't make any sense to add codes of injuries. What you need to do, you need to count them. So for that you go to field value setting and you select count. Okay. So in this case you have those counts. Now this table looks exactly the same as the one that you need to create. I'll add this information about percentages. In defense we have 49%, and then in offense we have 51%. Okay. So this is the table. Now, what are those percentages? Now, what you need to do on your own, you need to convert those frequencies into percentages using formulas. Look, this is why you need to convert them into percentages, because you need to compare what you would expect in terms of the injury frequency for defensive and offensive players on every turf versus the observed, right? Expected, what you observe, and this is what you expect. Now this is done for two variables. Now I'll just explain to you what I mean by that, by one variable. So first of all, I mean it's easy to figure out how those percentages were calculated. So here we have a grand total of 308 concussions, okay, and this is our 100%, and then 65% or 201 happened for turf, and then 107 or 35% happened for grass. Okay, and then it's broken down by defensive and offensive part. So so those are the percentages. Look, you can quickly figure out like where those percentages are coming from. Now think about it this way. This one now I'm trying to explain what I mean by expected versus observed. You see, for the defensive side, in the league you have 49% of players who are defensive players. Okay, so basically what it means, like if if you pick up like randomly 100 players, then 49% of them would be in the defensive position. So roughly it's like half and half, right? However, look, all the defensive players, they represent 49% of all players in the league. They account for only 44% of injuries in our data set. Okay, so in other words, if position of a player, defensive versus offensive, didn't have any impact on injuries, on concussions, then you would expect percentages to be the same. In other words, if it doesn't matter which player you are in terms of your chances of getting a concussion, then you would expect that since there are 49% defensive players, then they will also account for 49% of injuries. But here we have 44%, which means that it looks like the likelihood of getting an injury or concussion if you're a defensive player is slightly lower. Okay, not by much, but slightly lower. I would like to say that this is the kind of, and then again for offensive players, they represent 51% of all players in the league, but they account for 56% of injuries. So it looks like, if there was no impact which side you're playing on, then you would expect that it would be 51%, but it's slightly higher, which is 56%, which means that offensive players are slightly more likely to receive a concussion, to receive an injury. Okay, and that's why you need to convert to those percentages, because if you compare like numbers of players in the league versus numbers who are getting concussions, those comparisons are not meaningful, because the base is different. I mean, the numbers of players in the league is different from the numbers of players that receive concussions. So that's why you need to convert them into percentages to make comparison meaningful. But one thing I would like to say is that there is a formal statistical test. It's called a chi-square right here. So this formal statistical test is used to see whether the difference in those distributions of expected versus observed, this is what you expect, this is what you observed, is due to some random chance or due to some underlying pattern. So for that you need to use the chi-square test, and it's implemented in Excel, it's implemented in SPSS as well. So I strongly suggest you read about chi-square test and how to use chi-square test to test expected versus observed difference in tables. Okay, but we're not going to go into that. We'll just use those, I guess, rough visual conclusions from our pivot tables. So, so this is table 1. Now let's look at table 2. So here, it's the same thing. You will do it in this, tab 3. Now, it's the same thing. You have game field, right? So you'll include game field as your row variable right here. So I'll just go here. Well, let me create a new one. Okay, so I'll just create a new one. I'll go to Insert, Pivot Table, Concussions, again, a new worksheet. And this worksheet will be named by game field and practice regimen. It's similar, but instead of side of the game, offensive or defensive, you include practice type: high contact, low contact, or medium man-to-man contact. Because the hypothesis that we have is that teams who practice high man-to-man contact training regimen, they are more likely to have players who receive injuries. But maybe the opposite is true. Actually, there may be an alternative hypothesis. You can say that, well, if you spend a lot of time practicing man-to-man contact during practice, then you're less likely to receive concussions. But this is something that you will see from your data. Who is right? Does practice regimen influence concussions, and in what way? So yeah, there's a different column variable. So that's what we'll do. So we'll select injury number once again as our value variable, but again, you need to select count, not a sum. Okay, and then columns will be practice type or practice regimen. So we'll drag it from here to here. And then rows will be game field, okay? And we're not going to filter it by anything. So the same thing here, right? So we got the same table. Yeah, it's exactly the same. Again, those percentages are given to you. So basically high, 25%, it means that out of all teams in the league, 25% seem to have like high contact, or they seem to practice rough regimen for practice. And then 50% practice medium regimen, and 25% practice low. Okay. Now again, I mean, look, if type of regimen had no impact on concussions, then you would expect that teams who practice high man-to-man interaction during practice, that amount to 25%, they will also get 25% of injuries. Okay. But it looks like it's 31%. So which means that if you have this kind of regimen, you're more likely to receive an injury. Okay. Now, so I explained to you like one variable. Now, the second variable, something that you need to analyze on your own, is grass versus turf. Again, if grass and turf had no impact on injuries, then you would expect those percentages to be the same. In other words, somebody who is practicing somebody who has a team that has a high regimen will be equally likely to have injuries on grass and turf if the type of field had no impact. So it would be like 15.5, 15.5. But you see those percentages are different. In fact, the percentages for turf are higher, right, for all teams, which means that the second variable type of game field has an impact on the likelihood of a player receiving a concussion. Okay, so this is something that you can tell from those tables. But once again, you need to convert those tables into percentages. Okay, so again, look at 100%. So 100% is represented by 308. This is a breakdown by grass and turf, and out of that 65%, this is breakdown by regiment, and then out of those 35%, this is the breakdown. For teams practicing grass, this is the breakdown by regiment. Okay, so this is how you create this table, and those percentages are derived from these values. Okay, table number 4. So here we have injuries by position and year. So we have this position variable as our row variable. We have year as our column variable, and so basically in year 1 we had 4 injuries for the center, and in year 2 we had also 4 injuries for the center. So I'll go ahead and create this table, and then what I will do, I will explain like what those additional numbers are. Okay. So I'm going to summary. Once again, insert pivot table. So again, we'll select table named concussions. That's how we named it in the new worksheet. So we'll press OK. So just looking at the table, our row variable is position right here, so we check it. So our row is a position. Now our column variable is year, so we put year here. Once again, the summary variable, or the values we're using from sum of injury, but it's not sum, it has to be count. Okay, so you see this table looks like this. So once again, there you need to convert those values to percentages to make comparison meaningful. So 38 will be your 100%, so you'll put 100%, and then these numbers are converted to percent by dividing each of those numbers by 38. So this is how you create injury percent. And this data about league count and league percent is basically given to you. So basically they're saying, well, in the league, in total, in 2 years, there were 32 different centers. Okay, and that represents 4% of all players in the league. So you can just copy those numbers here. Okay, and then when trying to see whether position has any impact, has any impact on injuries, this is what you do. You compare league percent versus injury percent. So basically, centers represent 3% of injuries. Okay, but they represent 4% of all players in the league, which means centers are a bit less likely to receive an injury, because if they represent 4%, right, then you would expect that if position had no impact on injuries, that they would also receive 4% of injuries, right, just by chance. Okay. However, since they receive 3% of injuries, you're saying, well, it looks like they're less likely to receive an injury compared to other types of players. Now, if you look at wide receiver, well, let's look at the one that has more. Yeah. I think the data is wrong for wide receiver. It says more, but to me it looks the same. So maybe it's like it's different based on percentage points. Yeah, so let's look at I'm trying to find where the difference is very drastic. Okay, well, let's talk about this position, TE. So you see they represent 4% of all players in the league. However, they account for 7% of injuries, which means they are more likely to receive that injury. And more, what you can do, you can use nested if statements to compare those two numbers and say whether a particular position is more likely or less likely to receive an injury. And this number represents percentage of players in the league, I think, who received injuries. So basically you're saying that out of all players in the league for 2 years, 43% of them received injuries. And then there is another interesting observation when you look at the impact of year 1 and year 2 on injuries, on concussions. And just if you look at it roughly, it looks like as a rule, normally for year 2 the value is higher, right? So this is the same, this is higher, 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 same, higher, higher, this is higher, same, higher, higher, same, higher. So you see most of the values for year 2 are higher. It looks like the problem of concussions is growing in importance. In other words, in year 2, teams received players received more concussions for each of the positions. So it looks like the problem is growing. Okay. So, anyways, friends, I showed you how to create a table 4, tab 4. I'll let you figure out how to create analysis here by injuries by type of practice, and also injuries by type of game field. This is basically a very simple table. So once again, you'll have to create a pivot table with frequencies, and then you can convert those to percentages. I already explained this, but once again, it shows. Look, if somebody is saying that a type of game field has no impact on injuries, then you would expect the frequencies to be equal, right? In other words, you would expect that half of the injuries will happen on grass and half of the injuries will happen on turf. But here you clearly see that turf accounts for 65% of injuries, while grass for 35%, which means, this table suggests that type of game field has an impact on concussions. In other words, if you're playing a game on grass, you're less likely to receive concussion. If you're playing your game on a turf coating, field coating, then you're more likely to receive a concussion. Okay. So that's all. Again, if you want to learn details about creating pivot tables, please watch those video tutorials. In fact, I'm requiring you to watch them. And that's it. That concludes part 4 of our video presentation. Thank you for listening.